and it's been widely used in research, and that's even though there's no real standard yet in the entire industry. It has become seemingly a hallmark to do a screening for people to try and classify them as addicted or not addicted. Next slide. A lot of people ask me what the consequences are because they say, you know, internet is good, and internet is good. Obviously, we're using the internet just to have our conference here. So it's not that it's an unproductive tool. It is a very productive tool. But to the extent that people use it, it becomes damaging in some aspect of their life. For example, some of the earlier research on just personal kind of ramifications of internet addiction. Early studies done by Carnegie Mellon University as early as 97, 98 had found that social isolation was reported amongst 178 people who had never used the internet before. They gave them computers, and over a 2-year longitudinal study found increased levels of depression and social isolation. So this was really remarkable research back then, because at this point, if you look at the late 90s, people were really trying to get online and not try to discourage use. Stanford University did another very large study of about 5,000 internet users, saying increased levels of social isolation were reported with increased levels of internet use. And part of it is the computer's very solitary activity. It's not like television watching. I mean, if anything, it's more personalized, it's more customized. And so that leads us to bigger problems with social isolation as a culture. Academic problems were found at campuses like Kathy Shear at the University of Texas at Austin found that 14% of students fit the model of internet addiction, but less than 1% ever sought help. So you're starting to see trends, even in the late 90s, that internet use could be a problem. Other physical problems were reported in some research by Chen, Ling, you know, just finding excessive use caused sleep problems, you know, back strain, eye strain, the kind of hunched over thing that you get with the internet. It's really quite damaging. Even like using the mouse, quite often people were getting like carpal tunnel syndrome in their arms. Relationship problems was something that I found very early on as well. A lot of internet use ended in divorce for middle-aged couples. Young couples broke up. Boyfriends, girlfriends broke up. Relationship problems seem to be a very big thing because, again, the social isolation. The other thing that I found was an interesting study by the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. So these are our divorce attorneys here in the US, found that 63% of divorces were caused by online affairs, because online affairs are very popular, at least here in the States, becomes a very big problem with marital infidelity. Work-related problems also are a big thing, at least in the United States. WebSense in 2003 found that you know, people were getting online at work for personal reasons, recreational use. This became a productivity issue in the workplace. Job loss, very many stories in the early 2000s here in the States about like Xerox, Dow Chemical, and the New York Times all fired people because of their internet use. But the thing about the US, we can sue for wrongful termination if internet addiction is recognized as a clinical disorder, which it's not. It is potentially something that an employee can sue for being wrongfully terminated. So the last point I have there is legal liability. IBM was sued for $5 million from an employee who was fired, claiming they were just addicted to the internet and they needed treatment and help, not getting fired from their job. Next slide. All I did was put together a few stories that were in the media to kind of show a more personal side of the consequences. One has to do with a 33-year-old woman who neglected her children, her young children, just to spend time online in a game called Small World. Another one, I put in there, a man in Korea died at the internet cafe after playing World of Warcraft. 2 parents in Vegas let their newborn child die because of gaming. Gaming is a very powerful aspect of the internet, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Next slide. Types of abuse. A lot of people actually question if internet addiction is real. And I don't believe the people at this conference are questioning that, but I think in general, society, at least in the United States, wonders and really minimizes internet addiction. They say, well, isn't it a form of other addictions that we have recognized, mainly sex addiction and gambling addiction, which is true. We have those independent of internet use. So what happens is that the thing about the internet is now you have an accessibility that you didn't have before for internet pornography, a very big problem here in the US. You have all kinds of content online because the internet's completely uncensored. For gambling, again, many gambling sites and sports betting sites are very popular here. But then you have some areas of the internet that are very specific to virtual environments. Like these are problems that wouldn't exist if the internet didn't exist. And those are things like chat rooms, adult rooms. These are very popular. People have cyber sex and they enjoy talking about sexual fantasies over the internet, even using webcams to share erotic pictures and so forth. Instant messaging, the same thing. A lot of people are chatting online. The multi-user role-playing games, my understanding is that in Korea, China, and Taiwan, that's probably the #1 area of concern is the online gaming. Less so here in the United States. I think because we have pornography, chat rooms, Facebook, those become more of the social problems that we're seeing. Next slide. People say, well, why online sex? A lot of times people will just ask me, well, why not have real sex? Well, with the internet, what tends to happen is that it's a very low risk. There's no emotional consequence. People can kind of go online, engage in whatever sexual activity they wish to, and then leave, and there's no real commitment to people. The other thing is that it's easy to believe you're not really cheating. Like, example, we have a big infidelity problem with online affairs and pornography, but it seems like you don't really think you're talking to somebody on the internet the way you would if you met them at the office or at a bar. So we have a lot of social issues much more in the United States than I think other cultures. At least in the research I've seen, you know, online affairs aren't the major issue, where I would say here in the US, that's become more prominent. And we don't know, you know, there's no culturally defined normal behavior online yet. It's still too new, so we really don't understand what sexual behavior is online and how that translates into offline behavior. Next slide. Internet gambling, as I said, is a very big thing. Again, here in the United States, more of the statistics and studies have been done. And I mean the poker sites and blackjack sites and things like that. It's accessible. It doesn't always seem real. It seems like you're just playing games, even though you have to have credit cards and pay cash for these kinds of activities. Teenagers are probably the biggest area of concern. Next slide, please. According to our National Council on Problem Gambling, teens make up the fastest growing amount of gamblers online. If you'll see the statistics, 16 to 24-year-old males, 4%, 11 to 18-year-old males, 4 to 7%. And these are pretty young ages to be addicted to internet gambling. We have real problems here because they can't be under 18 to enter a real casino. We have legalized gambling in many states in the United States, but they can go online and they can gamble and play games and get engaged that way. A lot of times they run up a lot of debt. They get into criminal behavior. They become truant from school, deviant type of behavior. You know, they start stealing, and overall it impacts their ability to sustain their academics as well. So it becomes a significant problem for young teenagers. Next slide. Understanding gaming, and gaming is not the same as gambling. Gambling is, you know, pretty much the, like I say, the poker, the cash exchange, the betting kind of game that you think of. The gaming that I'm talking about are the very sensationalistic kind of games that are the multi-user role-playing games, very immersive. These are persistent cultures that you create a character in the game that grows and lives in this superficial world, yet to the mind and eye of that user, that world is more real than the real world that they're living in offline, if that makes sense. What happens is that these are, especially for young males, these games are very powerful, very seductive problems. I have seen probably the hardest time recovering from these games. You know, there's a variety of development that goes into these games. I mean, Hollywood, you know, like The Matrix, for example, is a very popular American movie, probably popular all over. Hollywood makes a game called The Matrix, and they get all the voices of all the actors, and they make it like a big budget film. I mean, these are not just simple games anymore. They're very intense, high graphic, high involvement, and the biggest thing to these games is they're quest games. You have to play 8 hours to complete, say, a quest, an operation in the game, a military battle, whatever it is. It's time consuming. You have to organize your troops. You have to organize your weapons. You have to organize your supplies. Somebody is in charge of all this. So these are not just played by yourself. It's an organized group of individuals. And it's constantly changing. So it's really very exciting to play them, but obviously very, very dangerous as well, because it's very hard to break from the internet when you're on it for 8 to 10 hours at a time. Next slide. As I said, at least in the United States, things like Facebook and Twitter have become very popular social media. You know, a lot of people are using it now for just day-to-day conversations. It's very addictive and immersive, but in a different kind of way. A lot of times it could be relationship problems and people are going online, meeting old flames, meaning an old boyfriend or girlfriend from high school, but they're in their, you know, marriage and they're 40 years old now. So they're rekindling relationships, and sometimes in a maladaptive way. Next slide. And then finally, for the types of internet addiction, Second Life. These are not even games, they're virtual world. And Second Life, you create your avatars, and you live and you exist in the game. You can fall in love, you can buy a house, you can, you know, buy a storefront. You can do a lot of different things. It's very much like real life. If anything, economists study Second Life quite avidly because they watch consumer behavior. You have to spend actual physical money in the game to purchase items. I mean, it's not just like you play a game. You know, if you want to have a house, if you want to have clothes, if you want furniture for your house, if you want land, a car, the way you would in real life, you have to spend money in their economy, so to speak, to acquire those items. So it becomes very lifelike. And I think I have a couple of slides in there just showing, next slide, just some pictures of Second Life. People actually fall in love, have weddings. A lot of universities, I will say, hold classes now in Second Life. It's become very popular, and I know like Harvard has a space in Second Life for virtual classes for avatars. So it's what happens ultimately, the reality of all this is that it's blurring what's reality and what's fiction.